I'm really excited to dive in with you today on the most recent study regarding children who have received gender affirming care and their regret rates, their satisfaction rates, and their continuation of care rates. But before I get into all of that, and you're not going to want to miss it because this is a really important study, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about what's coming up on Black Friday. So, if you don't know, I have the School for Engendering Inclusivity. It is an amazing resource for anyone that wants to learn about gender, pronouns, how to create inclusive practice, how to audit your business yourself if you don't want to pay for a consultant, how to speak about sexual health and bodies in a gender inclusive way. All these courses are in there in bite sized pieces for you to learn and create a better understanding and be able to be a more gender inclusive provider. And the best part is that you get to meet with me live twice a month in office hours to ask whatever question you have about gender in a safe and non judgmental space. So, a 25% sale is coming on Black Friday through Sunday. Information is in the show notes or go to my website, engenderlove.com. And I advise you to sign up for my newsletter where you can be notified and reminded directly. Okay, let's dive in today. So, for those of you that don't know, a really amazing study just came out on October 21st in JAMA Pediatrics, which is the Journal of American Medical Association. And that's what I want to talk about today because we see so many times in the literature discussions on regret for transition, especially in children. And so, this research study directly questions and answers the question, and so we are going to look at it. And what I want to talk about is why this is so important as healthcare providers to understand this data and information. And even as supportive family and friends, you want to understand this data and what makes it so amazing. I'm going to talk about the study itself and what I think is really incredible about its design and some of its limitations. And then I'm going to talk about what does this all mean. So let's start out with why I think it's so important to know. I think as healthcare providers, as I've mentioned in the past, it's part of our job is to combat misinformation and to do it with facts and data. So this provides you some facts and data that when people say, well, most kids regret it, what you can answer is no, actually, 97% of kids continue their care 6 to 10 years out, are still going. About 3% do discontinue care. Most are satisfied. Those are the kind of answers you're going to get, and I'll explain why you can use the study to say those things. But more importantly, I think it's important to understand the significance of this study. One real big significance is that all the subjects in the study transitioned prior to puberty. Now, why is that significant? Most of the times, most of the studies we are looking at, people have transitioned after puberty. So, like the US Trans Survey is an amazing survey done every few years, the last one in 2022. Most of them transitioned post puberty. Most of the information and the experience people have are kids that transitioned or people that transitioned after puberty. And so this is a study about those that transition prior to puberty, which I think is really important and something that many providers don't know a lot about because there's a different biological experience for these patients. There's a different psychology sometimes for these patients, and there can be a different medical experience as well. And I think it's important that we start looking at this group and understanding it, especially since in the United States, the first generation of kids who transitioned prior to puberty are now in their early 20s. So it is great to have a study that looks at this group of people. It is something I often help providers with is understanding those differences with patients that transition prior to puberty, something that many providers still don't have a lot of experience yet, again, because of the age of that first generation. The other great thing about the study is it's prospective. So they brought people into this study when they had socially transitioned. They were younger than 12 years old. And so they didn't know who was going to go for medical care and who wasn't. And it's this amazing collection of data that's been collected over the past 6 to 10 years. And finally, the great thing about this study is it directly answers the question, what is the satisfaction rate? What is the regret rate? As well as what's the continuation of care? And the reason I say this is many times we extrapolate the information based on who retransitions and who does not. Now, what I mean by retransition is that if somebody transitions after they have transitioned, so many times we hear the term detransition, which I don't really like that term because you can't untransition, you just transition again. to an identity that's more authentic to you, more in alignment with you as you learn about yourself. So I wouldn't really call it a detransition, but that is the term you might see in the media. And I just also want to make you aware that sometimes in research, for many years, the term desistance was used as the research term to indicate the same thing. But for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to say retransition. Many people assume that if someone retransitioned, that meant they regretted their decision. And that is not always the case. Many people don't regret their decision, may discontinue care because they come into a better understanding of who they are and what they want, but it doesn't mean they regret that journey to get there. There's also people that will discontinue care because for health reasons, maybe they've been advised not to take hormones any longer. Some people stop because they obtain the results they've desired. They have the changes, the physical changes they want, and they don't want to continue medication anymore. Another reason is sometimes resources. People may not have the financial resources, the money any longer to continue their care. And some people may not have the resources of providers in their area, depending on where they are. So there's a multitude of reasons, and many times we assume that if someone stops care, that they regret it, just like we assume that people that continue care are satisfied. So the benefit of this study is it directly asks and looks at those regret and satisfaction rates. So that's the amazing thing about the study. Now, what I love about the study that makes it so incredible, so I'm going to nerd out a little bit here because I really love research, is that this is a study where that, like I mentioned, is prospective. Between the years of 2013 and 2017, they got their subjects. And you can go through all the data in the paper, but basically everyone was before 12, had socially transitioned, and they followed them through surveys throughout the years. And so this study was based on the 2023. So they had 6 to 10 years of data from people. Now, I know people that have been part of this study, so I know that these surveys take at least 30 minutes. They're given to the parents, they're given to the transgender or non binary child. So, what this study looked at was the survey from the transgender or non binary child. If that survey had not been returned by the child, but they had the parent survey, they looked at the parent survey. Now, here's the amazing thing they had the survey back from some member of the family 82%. Now, if you know anything about surveys, 82% is an extremely high response rate that is absolutely amazing. But it still begs the question, what about the other 18%? Are we assuming that they're continuing care? Are we not, etc.? And so they tried to get more information. And so for some of the subjects, they had the survey from the year before. Some of the subjects they had been in contact with via email that had shared some of their thoughts and feelings. And so they kind of had a secondary set of data looking at them and found that that secondary data where they didn't directly answer the survey, but they had some information of satisfaction versus not, had data that was consistent with that primary group that did complete the survey. So if you include that secondary group that had had some communication and had expressed satisfaction or regret about treatment, then you're getting up to 87% response rate. Again, phenomenal response rate. Looking at the 220, it was statistically unlikely for subjects to be unsatisfied or regret their decisions, meaning the number of people that reported it was so low that it can be assumed that most people will be satisfied and continued. Now, as far as the people that reported regret of treatment, it was 9 subjects. 9 subjects either regretted using blockers, regretted using hormones, or regretted using both. So out of that 9 out of 220, we're only looking at the primary group. 9 out of 220. And out of those 9, 4 of them had discontinued care, meaning they had they were not doing any more hormones or puberty blockers. 4 out of 220. There was one person who said they were going to stop care but hadn't done it yet. So if we include them, 5 out of 220. And then the other four, even though they had reported some regret either for puberty blockers or for hormones, they were continuing care. So that brings us to the number that 3% discontinue care, 97% continued care. And yes, we know that 4 of those reported some form of regret, and we don't really have the information of what made them decide to continue care, but what we do know is they are continuing care now. Now, I encourage you, if you're a research nerd like me, and I don't want to get into it here, but there's so much amazing things in this research paper. They discuss how they handled data that was hard to understand, meaning like if somebody rated highly their regret rate and high satisfaction, giving the same number to both. They also had the scale of 1 to 7. They also had short answer questions to hear some of the thoughts and feelings around these things to confirm some of the numbers there. It's a really well done, beautiful study going on the strengths. Again, it's prospective. It's directly asking the question of satisfaction versus regret versus continuation of care and the limitations that these are US and Canadians, the high socioeconomic. So it's not a very socioeconomically diverse group, nor racially diverse group, and you can get all the information there. So there are limitations to the study, but it is the first of its kind. And the significance of this is it goes along with some of the other information we know. Now, we've never asked regret rate directly, but there are some good studies on looking at kids who detransition, and it's about the same. It was 2.5% in a study published in 2022 in the Journal of Pediatrics. But I want to say something more about this. I was just listening to Dr. Cade Gepford talk. They are a gender affirming provider. They're the head at Children's Minnesota. And they were talking about how we don't usually talk about regret rates when it comes to treatment, when we're evaluating the usefulness of a treatment. Gender affirming care is really the only one we discuss. What we usually look at is quality of life and complications and using that as a risk benefit management. So, why do we do it for gender affirming care? Why aren't we looking at the quality of care? And that's one thing I think the study does do by looking at the satisfaction rates and regret rates and asking a lot of questions. But why do we do it for gender affirming care and not other parts? And I think this is a really important question to ask. But also, as much as I have empathy for anyone that regrets a decision that they make medically, looking at the overall numbers is important. We get very caught up in individual people, and we can feel for those people. We can have empathy for those people. And just like every other part of medicine, we look at the numbers as a whole. 97% continue care. The majority of people, not just a little, high majority of people are very satisfied with their care. It was something like 94% of the subjects in the study were happy with when blockers started or wished they had started sooner. And 96 to 100% of people in the study reported that either they were happy with when hormones started or they wish they had started sooner. It was as little as between 0 to 6% that reported they wish it had been started later or not at all. So the satisfaction rate here is very, very high. And I just want to put it in perspective because you may say 3% is too much. And so let me put it in perspective. As some of you may know, my husband is a cardiologist. And so I hear a lot about cardiology. And one statistic that stood out to me was the statistic that patients, low risk patients that need a cardiac bypass. So low risk means they don't have any other issue besides their heart disease, that need a cardiac bypass. About 97% of them will survive the surgery and have a better quality of life, live a longer life from the surgery. And about 3% will die. Let me say it again. 97% not only will survive the surgery, they will have a better quality of life, they will live longer. However, 3% will die. What do you think most patients choose? To not have the surgery means quality of life won't improve, life won't extend, whatever symptoms they're having from their heart disease are going to continue to get worse. What do you think most people decide? Most people go for that 97%. I always say there's not always and nevers. Everyone doesn't decide one way. Most people go for that 97% with the risk of death being 3%. There is no risk of death here. There is a risk of regret. And that 97% is demonstrating living longer with a greater quality of life as well. I don't think it's that difficult to decide, and that's my personal opinion. I also don't want to ignore the 3%. I think it's important to continue to study to understand what leads to that regret. How best can we support these families and these patients prior to transition as well as after transition to begin to understand that small 3%. But I would not ignore that 97% continue care, that most people are beyond satisfied, and we're improving the quality of life and the length of life of these patients. That's why gender affirming care is part of the standard of care. That's why multiple medical associations support gender affirming care. So, as providers or family members or friends, and how to be supportive, it's understanding the misinformation. When people say, well, most kids regret it. No, they don't. Very small percentage regret it. If you take into account those 9 that regretted it, regardless of whether they continued care or not, it's 4%. 4%. 3% discontinued care, but it was only 4% that expressed any sort of regret. 96% did not regret their transition. Those are the facts from this study. A very well designed, well written, well explained, well executed study. And it's consistent with most of the information that we know about retransition rates in this population. And so let's keep going with facts and data because research matters.